Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. My name is Penny Colpin, and I'm continuing on with this series on better metaphors and analogies. As I'm counting, this should be segment 6. I'm hoping I've prepared a bunch of them and I'm recording them within a short period of time and then releasing them. Um, just a reminder that, nowhere in here am I trying to provide medical advice or anything like that, or trying to tell people how to think, what to do. I'm just sharing ideas that, as I look back at my own journey with non-ordinary states of consciousness, there were so many metaphors that are better than the standard one, or the most common one used in mental health circles, that of, these are illnesses like diabetes. And I've long said what I experienced was no more an illness than a fractured leg. Okay. But having said that, as I looked at all these different metaphors, I grouped them together. So today I'm going to talk about metaphors that are related to being enclosed or trapped, specifically trapped in a web as such. And I even made a note, perhaps even strangled. So as much as I'm trying to look at the camera, which I want to do, I do have my notes, and so I'll be going back and forth. One of the ways I look at it is that it's as though this web that builds around you, and you could call it the web of life if you want, but how that changes over time and becomes more demanding, more restrictive. It's related to conditioning. I need to do more and more and more in this environment, and then I can succeed. Um, if you become trapped in something quickly, you're more likely to try and get out of it and fight against it. Think of an animal stepping on a trap and their leg getting caught. However, or I would say even an insect getting caught in a spider web. However, if that, I guess, web tightens slowly over time or becomes more restrictive over time, you're less likely to notice it until you wake up to it. And that's why the concept of spiritual awakening often is used for this type of experience. So a couple of analogies is just that, as simple as a lizard shedding skin, right? It's a process. And in fact, it's not a bad one because sure, you're getting rid of old, I guess you could call it useless skin or what have you. It's not serving you well. But that which emerges looks pretty much identical, right? It's not like after this lizard has gone through this process, it looks and functions completely differently. But there is a shedding, there is a removal of old material that isn't of value. Another one, breaking out of some kind of prison, and that's where some of the lyrics, I made a note of Prisoners of Our Own Device from Hotel California by the Eagles, that we make these prisons of our own device. And at some point, under certain conditions, a person will feel the need to break out of that. Another song I'd noted was, you don't have to live like a refugee. You have to fight to be free. And there's a whole thing about freedom, which to me, freedom is an illusion because you're never actually free from the web. Freedom is relative, but there is no actual absolute freedom in my take. You're not free from your history. You're not free from the structures you build. You can break them and piece them back together, possibly. We're not free from each other. We're not free from the laws of physics. So again, freedom in my take is relative. And that's where one of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein is, reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. And that's where I say freedom is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. And that's why I believe we're supposed to develop systems that work for all. And that's what the goal is. And frankly, overall, I think we've had a hard time with it. But anyway, that idea of breaking out of a prison, there's the analogy of the frog in the pot of water, which is a fairly common one. And in fact, I thought of it a few days before I flew to Banff back in 1998. And it goes to the idea of conditioning. Now, the analogy says that if you take a frog and you have a pot of boiling water, and you try and put the pot or the frog in the pot of boiling water, it'll try and jump out. I mean, it's a cold-blooded animal, but it'll recognize, hey, something shocked its system, and it'll try and get out of it. But if you take a pot of just lukewarm water or room temperature water and put it on the stove, put the frog in it, and then turn on the heat under it, that the frog, because its system is cold-blooded, that system will continue to adapt and adapt and adapt as the water gets hotter, and the frog won't recognize how dangerous it is. Now, according to the analogy, the frog will just sit in there and die. From what I understand, that's not quite true, that at some point the frog does try and get out, but that's the analogy, and it goes to the idea of conditioning. So there's another metaphor, one that I came up with, well, or at least I experienced through this, through the force of it, is the idea of being a single cell in part of a larger body, which kind of goes to what I was talking about, you're never free from the web. But for me, it's like the awakening of a single cell in my body that looks around, it's doing its business, it has its level of consciousness, and it's functioning as it's supposed to. And somehow it comes to recognize, wow, I'm a part of something so ridiculously big. And all these other cells around me don't realize it in that same impact. And you could make the argument of, I was reading John Weir Perry's Far Side of Madness earlier this year, and he talked about logos and eros as two driving forces. Logos has to do with more the mind, the intellect, the reasoning. Eros has more to do with the emotional, the feeling, the sensation. And so obviously you can look around and say, gee, I'm one person out of 1 million people in the state of Montana or 340 million people in the US. I can make that statement from a logical standpoint, but does the mind really grasp what 340 million is? And that's where the sensation comes in. That's where it is much more ineffable, which I think I've used in other videos of, you just can't describe the overwhelm of that. So the analogy is, in that you could say the cell woke up, that it's part of a much larger system, and getting a glimpse of how big that is and how it functions and the variability of what it takes for that to function. Now, you could call that larger body that all these cells are part of. What is it, 8.5 billion of us on the planet currently? You could call that larger body humanity. There's probably other words, but that's kind of how I look at it. And so the idea there is that just like a cell has its level of consciousness and it's doing what it does, the blood, whatever those cells are doing, there's some kind of consciousness there for how it knows what to do. Or at least that's one way to look at it. But then think of the consciousness of the human being, or the consciousness of an organ, that all these cells are doing their thing, and then this heart is pumping for as long as the physical body is alive. It's not worried as much about what's the eye doing. It's focused on, this is my level of consciousness, or this is my function in the bigger body. So now take it as a person, and there's hundreds or there's billions of us. What is that collective consciousness? Could you call that the consciousness of humanity? And is that something that during these processes of ego collapse, growth, whatever you want to call them, stress breakdown, all of that, without that protection of the ego, does the person experience that higher level of humanity consciousness? I don't know. If you listen to some people's description, you might pick up on that. So I'm just sharing that. With regards to awakening, I decided to go ahead and I'll share a couple of quotes. I mentioned in my book that I'm a quote junkie. I freely admit it. And each of the chapters in the first section, I have, I'm sure you've seen books where they have one quote, and some of my chapters have like four, just because they're such great quotes. So at the start of one of the chapters, I use a quote from John Muir that says, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe." So that's that idea of this part, and yet it's hitched to everything in the universe. Another one from Richard Feynman, who was, I forget if he actually won the Nobel Prize in physics. I know he was nominated, but he was a physicist dealing with quantum and quantum mechanics. But he said, nature uses only the longest threads to weave her patterns so that each small piece of her fabric reveals the organization of the entire tapestry. So again, that goes to this small piece has consciousness of the much bigger. And back even in 1998, I had said, boy, if I fail to recognize the web of life creating a noose around me, I will have to go through this again. In 2016, the noose wasn't specifically around me, but it was around a large number of Americans that it woke me up to the collective pain and suffering of so many. So anyway, that idea of the cell as part of a larger body, of being, I don't know, you could call it ensnared, or at least recognizing the bigness of what it's part of. Another one that I came across, or actually just made up a few days ago as I was thinking about these, is I often wake up in the middle of the night, and I actually even keep a little flashlight and a notebook to capture some of the things kind of muddling around between that state of sleep and full wakefulness. And I enjoy just capturing some of these thoughts. At some point, maybe I'll pull them together in a book, who knows? And if not, I've at least captured them. But this one I thought of in terms of like syllables when used in speaking, okay? That each syllable by itself has certain properties to it, but it's when those syllables are combined into other things called words that those syllables gain meaning. And even then, the meaning is still limited to the language that it's part of. So, for example, I speak German. So a number of the syllables we have in English and German overlap, but the meaning that it takes in these strings of syllables can vary greatly. What made me think of it is years ago, I was riding on a train from Germany to Amsterdam, and it was one of these cases where you had two seats that faced each other and there was a table in between. And so across from me and slightly forward was a group of Dutch teenagers playing the game of Uno. And they're talking away in Dutch. Now, Dutch is a Germanic language, and sometimes when I look at it, I can figure out what the word means because it's close enough to German, or it's close enough to English. But when it's spoken, I have no idea what people are saying for the most part. And so here's this group of teenagers, and they're playing Uno, and they'd be doing their thing, and then someone would say something, and all four of them would burst out laughing. And I remember just looking at that thinking, isn't that amazing that their minds are structured in such a way that that series of syllables and strings of words or what have you had meaning in such a way that they all burst out laughing. And of course that happens in any language, but it was interesting to kind of watch that from outside because it happened often enough. And I thought, boy, these guys are having so much fun. And yet here I am, because I don't understand that, not recognizing how those syllables come together in a meaningful way. So, that I wouldn't say it was necessarily ensnared, but it does go to the idea of this piece as part of something much bigger. And another metaphor I use for this type of thing and this does go more to, feeling enclosed or feeling entrapped, is a dog shaking off water. So, if a dog's been swimming, they get out, and even if you have a towel right there and you try and grab them, you might try and dry them. And as soon as you remove that towel, the first thing they do is shake off that water 90% of the time. Okay. And that's where there was a comment from Carolyn Mace. Actually, when was it? About February of '99. I was living in Billings. I'd moved back to Montana by then. There's a woman named Joan Borisenko, who I think she graduated with a PhD in divinity from Harvard, written a number of books. She came and gave a talk in Billings. One of her books is Fire in the Soul, which is not a bad metaphor either. But she mentioned that, I believe it's Carolyn Mace, who's an American mystic, had used the phrase that these periods of awakening, she didn't use the term awakening specifically, but these periods of eruptive, I don't remember what specific words she said, but these types of experiences of spiritual awakening or whatever, she said it's as though the soul tries to shake off the trappings of this world. And I'm so glad I heard her say that, because in the healing period afterwards, I was like, yeah, and there was a whole lot of shaking going on. And that's where then, when the people around the person who's going through this process, their nervous systems get dysregulated, and their natural tendency is to try and put that towel and wrap that person back up without their consent, they do that as a way of making themselves feel safe. And the more you try and do that, frankly, I think the more damage you can do, because then that person no longer trusts you. Because I think in some cases, like, I trusted that I could get through this. And too often there were people trying to shove me back in to the same role that broke me open to begin with, which ties in with another class of metaphor, but that I'll share in a future video. But anyway, this idea of shaking the toxicity off, shaking the crap off, shaking just the water off, And when you think about like a dog shaking off water, that's actually a violent process. There's a fair amount of force involved in getting those water droplets, or as many of those water droplets, to have enough force to get off the pieces of fur. So, so there's a few different metaphors related to what I consider like being part of a bigger web, sometimes feeling ensnared in a web, or that where you're at in the web is no longer working for you and you need to break free so that you can get to a better place. Hopefully that provides some value, or if you find someone that might be of interest to, please share, like, subscribe, all that stuff. So anyway, thanks for joining me in this segment, and I hope you found something of interest, something of value, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.